and welcome to the Jack, Joseph, and Morton Mandel Center for Studies in Jewish Education at Brandeis University's Learning About Learning series. I'm Jonathan Krasner. I'm a core faculty member here at the Mandel Center, and I'm delighted to welcome you on this for this ongoing series of conversations with scholars of Jewish education. We created this series as a way to share scholarship in the field of Jewish education with a broad audience of educators and Jewish leaders. At the Mandel Center, we're committed to developing and promoting scholarship in Jewish education, especially scholarship on teaching and learning in Jewish education, in order to make a deep and lasting difference in the lives of learners and the vibrancy of the Jewish community. That's our mission. Today's session and our other events help us to serve our mission by getting important ideas out into the world. We encourage you to take a look at the Mandel Center events page to see the rest of our upcoming events. We're delighted to have so many of you joining us live, and we're hoping to be able to take some of your questions as we go. So feel free to post those questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. We're also recording today's session, and we'll make the recording available afterwards. But for those of you who can't join us today, but the recording will only capture the presenters and not the audience. Our guest today is Benji Davis. Dr. Davis is an assistant professor at the Azrieli Graduate School of Jewish Education and Administration of Yeshiva University, and Benji is also the director of Impact Israel Education. Today, we're here to talk about Benji's new article, co-authored with Hanan Alexander, entitled You Never Told Me, The Pedagogical Content Knowledge of Israel Education, and this article appeared in Contemporary Jury. Benji, welcome. Great to see you.
Great to see you. Thanks for having me. And hi to everyone out there that I can't see your faces.
Why don't we start by you telling us a little bit about why you wrote this article and what your motivation was.
So my motivation was to get a PhD, to be perfectly honest. When I started out about 8 years ago, to really explore Israel education as a disciplinary field within Jewish education. And my question for my doctorate was, how do teachers that teach about Israel in Jewish education, what do they know about their teaching and how do they teach it? And that's rooted in theory of teaching and scholarship called pedagogical content knowledge. And without getting into like the specifics of the terminology, there's something like unique that all of us know, that teachers have a special knowledge, but maybe only us teachers feel we're special. But we have a special knowledge, which is we know about a subject. And if we're good as teachers, what else do we know? We know how to teach that subject. So that's pedagogical content knowledge, right, in a nutshell. So what do teachers of Israel in Jewish day schools or Jewish high schools in the English-speaking world, what do they know about teaching Israel? That was my big question for my doctorate. And I wrote 3 academic articles based on that question. And this article was the first one.
Great. So tell us a little bit about your methodology. Can you describe the design of the study? Can you tell us a little bit about who you spoke with and where they teach, just so that our audience has a sense of like who we're talking about here?
Yeah, so that actually was an accident. And there was this really big worldwide pandemic called Corona in Israel, or COVID-19. So my original design was actually to do ethnographic observations of study abroad programs in Israel and to still focus on the educator. What do they know? How do they teach it? Why do they teach it? But it was going to be observations out in the field. And then people stopped coming to Israel. And so in my proposal defense meeting, it was suggested, well, why are you so focused on observing teachers in Israel of students from outside of Israel? There's this thing called Zoom. You can talk to teachers all over the world. And so I had to completely flip my design to do what's called, I still really can't pronounce it, a phenomenological study, and based on which seeks to investigate the phenomenon or the experience of the person of which you would be investigating. So the phenomenon that I was investigating was teachers of Israel, of English-speaking students in the Jewish world. And so I sought to find teachers that were thought of as good teachers, right? I called them exemplary, experienced, excellent, and and really, without sort of a competency evaluation, if you're a parent on the call, how do you decide which daycare or preschool or school, high school to send your kids to? You talk to people and you get to know. And so there's a way of doing that also to pick kind of who will you investigate that also works in academic inquiry. And so I ended up finding 20 teachers, 8 in the United States, 4 in Australia, 5 in Israel of English speakers and the study abroad programs, and 3 in Canada that teach a specific Israel-focused class in the high school setting between what would be 10th grade to 12th grade, within a wide range of what we would call denominational affiliations, from Reform, Progressive, Liberal to community pluralistic, community modern Orthodox to modern Orthodox, both co-ed and gender separated.
Cool. So tell me just a little bit about like why you decided to look at exemplars rather than sort of the average teacher.
So I think the best way to put it is it's not the exemplars. Maybe it's not the right word that I used. It's rather what is a rooted, what we'd call, Lee Schulman called it a wisdom of practice. But it's not exemplary that can't be replicated. Like, we believe in education, that education should be good, but it should be good that also can be, scalable, so to speak. That if we're trying to build theories of knowledge for teaching, for pedagogy, that can then be applied in practice. So you want good examples that also could then be done. So really, it's not that, it's everyone here is a LeBron James of teaching Israel, but they all could be in the NBA, right? Which is they're good at what they're doing. They're known to be good. And they also that others that maybe aren't yet in the NBA of teaching Israel education, not even the NBA. I used to think I was good at basketball at one point. I never could make the NBA, but Jewish kid in Jewish day school, I was good at basketball. So how can other people that, with the right theory and pedagogy and professional development and learning could also be good? So it wasn't that, and it's rooted in, what really helped me was Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot's book on the good school, right? Her portraits of these schools was so that other schools can model them, not that they exist as the New York Yankees or, a school that just is so unique that can't be replicable. Right. So that was what I was trying to do with the types of teachers I interviewed.
Makes sense. Total sense. And in terms of what you actually did you observe them teach? Did you speak with them? How did you gather information?
I interviewed every teacher twice. So 40 interviews of about 90 minutes, which was a lot of data. And this was before you had AI automatic transcriptions. I spent months trying to transcribe the interviews. And then also the documents that the interviewees, the teachers alluded to, the curricular documents, assessments, all the stuff that goes to, contribute to teaching. And then that was my data. And then I went to analyze it. And that's where I got to my conclusions.
Great. So tell us a little bit about the argument of the article, from a 3,000 or 30,000 foot level, what should we know about the article and what you were arguing in it?
So if you look in the article at the back, it has my interview protocol of the questions I asked. And what you'll see is the phrase "you never told me" is not a question that I had. It was not on my radar. But then I start interviewing teachers and they're like, "You never told me. You never told me. You never told me. We don't want the kids to say you never told me." And what was fascinating, that I just was shocked, you have a teacher in a gender separate modern Orthodox high school and a teacher in a self-described reform setting, both alluding to the same phenomenon. And we're talking about on multiple continents, from Australia, North America, and in Israel. We don't want our students to say we never told them. So therefore, we must teach Israel from a Zionist lens, that this is our narrative, this is what we find sacred, this is our tradition, but that normative disposition that this is a value we're trying to transmit to young people requires to also teach about perspectives and narratives that actually reject, critique that very narrative. Because if a student goes to a college campus and hears about occupation, settlements, or apartheid, ethnic cleansing, genocide, all of these things outside of the supportive environment of a Jewish day school or a Jewish high school, then it would actually go against the very point of what a Jewish education is all about, which is to transmit some sort of theory of knowledge of which a learner is like, oh, Jewish, I can find a meaningful way of living and behaving and believing in Jewish and in the story of the Jewish people. And that was the theme throughout.
Interesting. Why do you think that they were so focused on that? I mean, do you think that it had to do with uh, what they were hearing from the students themselves, what they were hearing from parents? I mean, did you get a sense of that from speaking with the teachers?
Yeah. So there's the yeah, in the article, there's kind of before I get to the main, we would call it the components of their knowledge of how they teach about Israel. Once again, what makes up their pedagogical content knowledge, that specific type of teacher knowledge. Why did you never told me this phenomenon of a student growing up in a Jewish day school system and never being told criticisms of Israel, and all of a sudden they just experience it like a jolt when they go to a college campus for the first time? That's that phenomenon. Why that influenced them had a lot to do with the cultural milieu, so to speak, of alumni in the school, families talking about it, also their personal experience. Like I remember one of the teachers, and I quote them, saying that he went to the school that he taught at, and they never told him in a way that he was trying not to prevent that from happening. Multiple teachers alluded to, actually, they also were never told, but they didn't reach the conclusions of those students that felt they were never told and then went, to no longer identify as a Zionist or members of the Jewish community, believing that there should be a Jewish state and that's meaningful for the Jewish identity outside of Israel.
Yeah, so it sounds like they've really kind of focused on college and university as kind of the motivation or kind of the thing in the back of their mind that they're thinking a lot about when they're talking about, when they're teaching about Israel. I mean, does that sound right to you?
Yeah, the genesis of this, and there's scholarship and literature on it. We call it Israel education now, but there's been different names for this field, which is the place of teaching Israel within Jewish education that dates back to the rise of the awareness of Zionism in the American context, let's say over a century ago. And so when I was growing up in high school, I went to a Jewish high school in LA, and I had an Israel advocacy seminar. So now that same school also teaches Israel, but it wouldn't call it an Israel advocacy seminar. It sees it as happening in Israel education. So the intention of an Israel advocacy seminar and its origins was to prepare for the student to go to campus in a way. It kind of just reflects, isn't that the point of a high school education is, to prepare, right? It's a college preparatory program. So it really, I think, aligns with kind of the vision of any sort of college preparatory school. And then where does Israel and Jewish fit into it? That was an origin of the Israel class. So now that we're in an Israel education phase as opposed to Israel advocacy, and the inherent intention is not to advocate actually for the state of Israel, which is say maybe that's how I was taught in my advocacy seminar, but rather to advocate for the identity of the student. Why Israel is or isn't meaningful to them? Why do they find it meaningful to be Jewish? Why are they a Zionist? It's not actually about the state. It's about the student. And so the teachers seek to prepare the student to be able to defend themselves. So like one teacher, I'm going to read a quote, he said about his class, "Let's have this discussion that you can defend yourself in a proper form, and you can do so at least somewhat wisely or more intellectually. In some cases, we end up having some of our students who become totally repulsed by Israel and go on the other side of it." So for this teacher, it's not about the state of Israel and its actions. It's rather about the student themselves, and that they can hold whatever identity that they find meaningful and wherever they find it within the story of the Jewish people.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because, I mean, it raises so many questions. For example, do these teachers distinguish between education and indoctrination? Because like when you talk about advocacy, that line is a very blurry line, right?
Yeah. So another quote of a teacher, why they teach this way, she called it, I guess it's kind of a little bit of exposure therapy. Right, right. So, and then I want to read a quote that I pulled out from an article that I published after October 7th, which wanted to investigate this "you never told me" phenomenon, but after October 7th, by asking teachers that teach about Israel in Jewish high schools in North America, do you still embrace this, complexity hypothesis that you should be teaching alternative perspectives that reject or critique Zionism? And one teacher, she said, like, there's no moderation. I guess everything is extremism now. And I guess really how it's changed is that I'm attempting to teach moderation. Even if it's moderation, I don't always feel myself. So that tension in the quote is the teacher trying to, after October 7th, and not all the teachers were there, but okay, I believe something different now, where I'm not actually believing in the teaching empathy for Palestinians because of their experience of what was happening during the war, right? That was their personal orientation that adjusted. But to still do the work of good education required teaching the other side. And so all the teachers that I interviewed after October 7th, and this wasn't a quantitative study, it was still a qualitative study based on interviews, and I interviewed 10 teachers in the follow-up study. They were navigating between whether the current events legitimized what they believed before October 7th, or they completely flipped. Let's say went right to left or left to right. But all of them continued teaching with this approach of rooting in the Zionist narrative, but also teaching about the Palestinian narrative, which I call, with Hanan Alexander, pedagogies of sacred indifference. And they did so because they believe that is the work of education, which empowers the autonomy of the learner, of the student, to decide what it all means for them. And the only way for the student to decide, you root it in a tradition of which the student is growing up in, which they find value in, but the student can only choose Jewish, Zionist, whatever version of Jewish and Zionist, by also being taught about perspectives and traditions that are different. And that didn't change pre or post October 7th. And I think that teachers believe if you don't do it that way, it's not that I think, this is what they said, then that's the difference between indoctrination and education. It's about empowering the student to decide for themselves, but in a supportive environment.
Right, but like encouraging students to think for themselves and to also be advocates for Israel on campus. There's a tension there,
But
isn't there?
that's sorry.
Go ahead.
No, that's the point. Is they're not actually promoting the students to be advocates for the state of Israel. That's not the point. Here, I even have another quote
Yep.
about a teacher who's Dafka, like very much so, saying this is not what we're doing. And
Hmm.
when the unit Israel advocacy was designed, I was very transparent that I'm not teaching how to be an Israel advocate. That's not my job. That's not how I see myself. So even when in a school where the class, let's say, was still holding on to the Israel advocacy, and they still wanted to call it Israel advocacy, and some of these teachers were teaching a unit or a class called Israel advocacy, but they all were very clear to me. I don't do Israel advocacy. This isn't the goal. My students shouldn't be advocates for the state of Israel, only advocates for themselves to figure out what the state of Israel means to them in their lives.
Right. Right. Yeah, I was going to ask you about the follow-up study, so I'm really glad that you brought it up. One of the things that I wondered about with the follow-up study was, you talked about how the teachers were intent on holding on to the pedagogy that they had adopted before October 7th. But of course, the political environment had changed so much. So I'm wondering if they felt a lot more pressure, from parents, from administrators, and whether that played a role, or even their own emotional kind of reaction to what was going on in Israel after October 7th. I would imagine that for a lot of them, it was traumatic. So how did that play into it?
It was traumatic. for many of the teachers, whether it was personal, right? Teachers that have family in Israel, lived in Israel, all that stuff. And on the other hand, how do they navigate their feelings and that sense of, what are they supposed to do? What they did was they continued with the class and they continued with the curriculum. When they went to teach right after, in the week of October 7th, you obviously have to adjust. And in both this study and the previous study, the You Never Told Me study, current events led to at some point that they would not do the planned lesson of the day because they really needed to talk about, what was happening outside of the classroom. But what I was most struck by, and maybe this had to do, I think, with my own personal context of, having lived in Israel for 15 years, and I did this research a few months after I moved to the States for my postdoctoral fellowship in the DC area, and I had also was familiar with Ziva Hassenfeld's research on Israeli teachers after October 7th and how they were teaching with what she called an ethics of care. So my thought was, the American or North American teachers will also be doing an ethics of care, and they won't be teaching or will be teaching the curriculum based on this notion that they're doing what's for the best for their students, and that the curriculum, modern Israel, history, the conflict, doesn't really matter. There's an existential war happening. And actually, there's just a very big difference in the North American context, which is even as the teachers and the students felt a part of the existential war, in terms of their identity, they weren't living it. So that allowed for the continuation of the program, so to speak, the continuation of the course and the curriculum. And so I think that allowed the teachers, okay, I'm still going to teach the curriculum. And while their political or epistemological, as their political identities changed or how they understood Palestinian society, organizations, the narrative, perspectives, how those differed, they still stuck to the same pedagogy of a rooted Zionist narrative while also teaching about a Palestinian narrative and other narratives that may reject and critique Zionism. And that's because they believe that's what education is all about.
Great. Cool. So one of the people, one of our audience members, has asked a question that I think is kind of interesting. She was wondering if you found that there were any red lines that these teachers had when teaching the Palestinian perspective. For example, you could criticize Israel, but what about like delegitimizing the very state of Israel as an idea? Like, would that be something that would be taught, or would that have a place in these, in these teachers' classrooms?
Yeah, as an idea of itself, of course it's taught, because it's the very notion of You Never Told Me, is to teach in a Jewish supportive environment things that may actually critique or reject the very basis of the vision, the normative vision of which a community, a teacher, a student finds meaningful to them. So to teach Palestinian perspectives, and a main idea within Palestinian perspectives of Zionism is actually that it's illegitimate and problematic. All the teachers are teaching it. Is then one teacher talked about that, okay, I taught the Hamas charter before October 7th, so since October 7th, nothing's really changed for me. Hamas was very explicit in its charter and what it thought about Jews, so I continue to teach it. So as in and why they're teaching the Hamas charter, and also the PLO charter, and that's very common, right? Documentary analysis of different documents that are important to teach history. So that's not necessarily, it's okay to bring in those ideas, all the teachers would do it. The question is, how do you bring it in that allows the student to interpret, to critique, and the space to do that fairly? A challenge would be for some students that they'll go ad hominem, that maybe could dehumanize Palestinians. And so teachers were very aware of, even if we want to, how do I say it like this? As in, they bring in Palestinian perspectives, not to tokenize it, but to actually deal with it that there's agency, and then they can critique it for based on their own analysis and allow students to do it, but it doesn't mean to dehumanize other people. And so how
Right.
can and that was a main big challenge for the teachers in the post October 7th space, when they were feeling the sense that I'm dehumanized as a Jew and as a Zionist, and I must teach perspectives and still respect the humanity of another side, where I'm questioning, wait, do I still believe that or not?
Yeah, that's actually a great segue to another question that we got from an audience member who was wondering whether the feeling of "you never told me" may have been less about the information and more about the like lack of empathy that that people were taught to feel. Like it wasn't so much that the Palestinian narrative wasn't taught, but that the Israeli narrative was taught, and there was an emotional connection to Israel and Israeli people, whereas the Palestinian narrative was kind of taught academically, but there was no sense of like I don't know, a sense of like the humanity, as you were talking about, of the Palestinians who were suffering, let's say, in Gaza. I don't know if you have any thought about that.
I don't have empirical evidence, but I have philosophical ideas on it, which are at the root of a lot of my scholarship, which is much of the Israel education field, both programs and even scholars and those that write about it, talk about strengthening connections and relationships with Israel. And most evaluation research looks at the identity metrics of how it is ritualized or behaved, or the attitudes that people have that be like, oh, that program worked. They like Israel more. They feel better about being Jewish because of the Israel experience, as opposed to thinking about the merits of why this is meaningful to someone who would have an Israel education. So it's not to objectify Israel, but rather what Israel means to them. And so a student that goes through an Israel education program or system or a course that's about cultivating connections and relationships, the educator may find it quite hard to deal with complexities and controversial issues, because they may assume, well, that doesn't help cultivate connections and relationships and emotional attitudes and making them feel good. And so I have I have research with students on their learning, of which I'm working on an article right now, and these were latter years of high school, talking about this is the first time they've ever dealt with Israel's complexities. And it was a liberating experience, and it wasn't threatening. It actually helped them strengthen their sense of why I'm a Zionist and why Israel is meaningful to me. And they didn't want to objectify Israel in terms of a relationship or something to connect to as like a sociological or psychological attitude, but rather, why am I a part of this? Why is it meaningful that I'm a part of this? And a way that I've been going into like a teacher's hat for a second, when I've been teaching these two slogans a lot after October 7th that have been embraced by Jews all over the world: Am Yisrael Chai, and We Stand with Israel. And I ask students, what are these two slogans? Are they the same? What do they mean to you? Does it make sense to use one versus the other? And I have, one student that has shared with me is never thought about the difference until the activity, and felt for them, not saying this is right or wrong, but just kind of alludes to this point, or my philosophical point about Israel education, where he's like, Am Yisrael Chai means I'm a part of the story, whereas We Stand with Israel presents some sort of distance that, like, oh, that's that thing. I support it because I love it. I'm Jewish. But if I say Am Yisrael Chai, it's like, oh, no, no. It's mine and it's meaningful to me because X, Y, and Z. And so I think that the challenge is to address what Matt Reingold, Sivan Zakai, and Alex Thompson in the recent article in the Journal of Jewish Education on teaching Israel to meet the developmental needs of students, and that we don't teach the controversies and the complexities of Israel at the appropriate developmental times, which probably actually hurts the whole agenda of harnessing connections and relationships to Israel. Now, I agree. I just disagree that should be the whole point of the first place, because Israel is not what to have a relationship with, but rather, what does it mean to you in the first place as an insider and not as an outsider?
Yeah, really, really interesting point. Believe it or not, our time is up, Benji. We could continue to talk about this for another hour or two, but we're going to have to bring it to a close. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank you for joining us. I want to also let people know that the next event is called Why Teaching Jewish Texts is Not Enough, with John Levison, my colleague here at Brandeis. I encourage you to check out all of the Mandel Center events on our webpage, and to see the videos of prior events as well. So thank you everybody for joining us, and we hope to see you soon. Take care.